Hi guys, in today's video we're going to take a look at the developing ideas of the atom, an exam style question, and finally a summary.
So let's take a look at how our ideas and the proposed models of the atom have changed over time. Well, in the BC period, a Greek philosopher called Democritus proposed the idea of an atom. He proposed that it was the smallest particle and that it could not be split any further. And his proposal is where we get the name of the atom from. It comes from the Greek atomos, to mean indivisible. Later, in the 1800s, Dalton developed this theory. He proposed an atomic theory that atoms make up elements, and that all atoms in one element are the same, and atoms of one element are different to atoms of another element. He also proposed that atoms are tiny, and just like Democritus had suggested, he believed that atoms cannot be divided. Here we can see a simple illustration of Dalton's theory. In 1897, Thomson began carrying out experiments, and between 1897 and 1906, he carried out experiments with cathode rays, and these allowed him to discover the electron. Thomson's discovery allowed him to propose his plum pudding model of the atom, where he believed that electrons moved in a sea of charge, where electrons carried a negative charge, and you can see his plum pudding model here. Later in 1909, Rutherford carried out a series of experiments. He fired alpha particles at a thin sheet of gold foil. Rutherford then measured the deflection, that's the change of direction of the particles. What he found was that most particles were not deflected at all, as he had expected. He also found that a small proportion of particles were deflected through a large angle, but most surprisingly he found that some particles were deflected back towards the source. Rutherford used his experimental results to propose a new model of the atom. Under his new model, most of the mass of an atom is concentrated in the centre. The charge of the atom was also concentrated in the centre. That was what was making the alpha particles bounce back. Negative electrons were proposed to be orbiting the central positive nucleus, and Rutherford proposed that the majority of the atom's volume came from the space between the tiny nucleus and the electrons that orbit. He also suggested that positive and negative charges balance to make the atom neutral. And you can see Rutherford's model would have looked something like this, with our tiny positive central nucleus and our electrons surrounding it. Well, in 1913, Bohr developed Rutherford's model. He said that electrons orbit the nucleus on clear paths, and his model is known as the planetary atom. Bohr's model was quite useful because it actually provided an explanation for the difference in energy of electrons at different distances from the nucleus. Later scientific discoveries, such as the discovery of the proton in 1918 and the discovery of the neutron in 1932, have further developed our scientific understanding. So now we have our modern-day model of the atom. We now understand atoms to be composed of subatomic particles. These are our protons, neutrons, and electrons. We understand that protons and neutrons themselves are made up of smaller quarks, and the electrons surround the central nucleus. So you can see how scientific breakthroughs and experiments have allowed us to develop our understanding of the atom, bringing us to this modern day model. So let's quickly go ahead and summarise the 5 key models. We've moved from Dalton's proposal of an indivisible atom to Thomson's plum pudding with electrons moving in a sea of charge to Rutherford's model of electrons orbiting a tiny central positive nucleus to Bohr's planetary model of the electrons orbiting on clear paths to our modern day understanding of a central nucleus composed of subatomic particles with electrons surrounding the nucleus. It's important to understand that whilst we've discussed precise dates for these discoveries, you don't need to be able to date the discoveries. The importance here is to appreciate how the model of the atom has developed and understand the key models and the ideas behind them. So now I've had a look how scientific discoveries have helped us to develop our understanding of the atom and allowed different scientists to propose new models. Let's go ahead and summarise what we've learned today. Over time, the model of the atom has developed. Initially, Dalton proposed that atoms are tiny and cannot be divided. Thomson then developed this idea to suggest that atoms were composed of electrons moving within a sea of charge. This was Thomson's plum pudding model. Rutherford then proposed that the electrons orbited a central tiny nucleus, and Bohr developed Rutherford's model and proposed that the electrons orbit the nucleus on clear paths. This was Bohr's planetary model. Under the modern-day model of the atom, we understand atoms to be composed of subatomic particles. These particles are protons, neutrons, and electrons. The protons and neutrons are themselves composed of smaller quarks, and the electrons surround the central tiny nucleus.